Okay, I'm here today in Fairfield, Iowa, and my neighbor Mike has asked me to tell a little story about how it is that I've come to live in Fairfield and a meditating community in southeast Iowa. My name is Carolyn Bartels, and I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I grew up in a town called Fallsington, which is the town that is about 3 miles from William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, his home along the Delaware River. And he preached in Fallsington at the Quaker Meeting House, which is kind of the main attraction in Fallsington. There, it's a village. Maybe the population was like 100, 200, maybe 300 people if you went all around. But it's like a little self-contained village that has been historically preserved, like Williamsburg, and has a organization that has rehabilitated or restored to the origins. Beautiful stone buildings. There's a Stagecoach Tavern in the middle of the town, and then off to the side are two Quaker meeting houses. So it's kind of a Quaker town, although there are few Quakers there. When I was growing up, there was one Quaker family that actually had worked for William Penn, their ancestors, when he was in the New World, the land that had been granted his father, Admiral Penn, for restoring King Charles to the throne. So his father was a military man who, did a great honor to the country and was given this land grant in Pennsylvania, but his son was a Quaker, and they're pacifists, so there was a lot of disharmony between father and son. But the father, beneficently wanted to get his son kind of give him his own place to run riot. So he gave this huge land grant to his son. And at the time that he got this land grant, he was the largest private owner of real estate in the world, other than the royal family. So it was quite a thing, but he was a Quaker in England, causing all kinds of problems, spent a lot of time in jail for basically expressing his understanding that the individual had rights that were self-evident, that didn't have anything to do with crown or king. Wrote a book called Neither Crown Nor King. And this was, to say the least, revolutionary, because the church and the crown, they were without question. Their authority was without question, but the Quakers did question them. And so he ended up in Pennsylvania. And I tell this because as I was reviewing my life, his history was my legacy. It's growing up in this town, which really looked like the 1700s. I kind of grew up in the past, and there was a tremendous reverence for the efforts of those who had come before us and the principles that created what became the United States of America. There was also a presence of people, families who had fought in the Revolution. My best friend growing up, her ancestor was the person who gathered the boats for when George Washington crossed the Delaware. Just a farmer, but played a pivotal role. That was considered to be the battle that won the war, or one of the main turning points. Simple people, but this was the mix of people that I grew up with. And there was a tension between the Quakers who espoused pacifism and, let's say, those who followed George Washington, revolutionaries, soldiers, and there was a conflict in the air. I was very close with this family, the Snipeses, who were, the ancestors to William Penn's friends, let's put it that way. Quakers are called friends. And I was sort of like an adopted member of their family. And I was brought up a Catholic. My father was Catholic. My mother was Protestant. My father was he was a real estate appraiser. He built housing developments, a salesperson, but he became a real estate appraiser. But his true love was playing the piano. He played bebop, in my home, Art Tatum and Thelonious Monk were the heroes. They were the geniuses that were extolled. He played. I used to love to listen to my father play the piano, and he wrote songs. And my mother was a fine artist, a fashion illustrator by trade, a professional woman before she married my father, and a fine artist, and a good fine artist. She would paint the surrounding areas that were so beautiful. In the spring, a riot of pastel colors. In the fall, the bright reds and oranges of the leaves on the trees and the blooming bushes and flowers. I mean, it was just a gorgeous, gorgeous area with these stone houses and just beautiful, beautiful. But I was close with this Quaker family. And the lawyer, the father, who was a lawyer, was in business with my father, who was a real estate appraiser, and they took cases to court when the government would come in and condemn property for what's the word when eminent domain, and then the landowner would have to be given whatever the jury, if they took it to trial, would award them for the valuation of their property. So one day when I was 8 years old, my father took me to court up at the county seat of Doylestown, and I watched Perry Mason like the rest of the nation, and that Perry Mason moment, I just loved the courtroom. I thought it was so exciting. But going up to be in the courtroom, my father was on the witness stand. It was very exciting. Everybody's dressed up, very official. And at lunch, we went out with the lawyers to this lovely restaurant, wonderful restaurant. And to me, this group of people had it going on. They were well-dressed, well-fed, intelligent, joking, and they just seemed to enjoy life. They seemed to have really hit their mark, and I thought, this is a great life. I mean, I'd never seen a group of people who, they're kind of independent-minded spirit, not punching a time clock, and, going for the victory and the argument and the case, and it's just so exciting. I thought, I'm going to be a lawyer when I grow up. 8 years old, a girl. I wanted to be a professional ball player too. I love baseball, and as I reflect, it's amazing to me that I didn't realize that probably wasn't going to happen because I was a girl. And 8-year-old little girl, I had more chance of becoming an attorney, but still, it was breaking into new fields. But I aimed big, and my heart was in it. I was going to do this, and I was a good student, did well in school, and wanted to get good grades, and I was in the top classes, and most of the people that I went to school with ended up becoming attorneys or accountants or whatever, doctors. So it wasn't out of the question. Now, this Quaker family that I was close with, there were 6 kids in the family, and I was close with the eldest daughter. Another friend of mine invited me to a meeting. This is like in 1965. I was 15 years old, held at the house of one of the Quakers. And I don't think when I went there, I really knew what it was going to be all about. But as it turned out, this is 1965, and there was a representative, I think, of the American Friends Service Committee, his name was Bob Eaton. He's probably in his early 30s. And he came to talk about the Vietnam War and gave us a little history of how it was that the United States became involved in the war. And he told us that there had been an election throughout the country and the communists won, and he kind of made a case for why it was immoral for us to be in Vietnam. And I listened to him. But, my father was in the Second World War. My uncles all were. My 4th grade teacher was a Marine sergeant, been in the Pacific. On Memorial Day in Falsington, we'd have a huge red, white, and blue flag, and I was a flag-waving American. That's what I was brought up. I was brought up that. I knew about pacifism, but I just didn't think it was practical. I thought, there's times when a country, a people, person has to defend themselves, and the case that this Bob Eaton was giving, maybe the Vietnamese had to defend themselves, the North Vietnamese, I just didn't get it. So, Being the aspiring lawyer that I was, I took this guy on. I was 15 years old. I took him on, and I made my case for why his case of pacifism wasn't practical, and it was a knock him down, drag him out argument. And I was so puffed up with my ego, and I was just like, I think I won that argument. I just wouldn't let it go. I was boom, boom, boom. It's just, oh man, I really got it. I got chops. I am so good. So I went home, didn't think much about it. And a couple weeks later, oh yeah, I got to set this up. One of the people who had come to this meeting was the cousin of this family, this Quaker family that I was so close with. And for some reason, he had come to this meeting. Well, a couple weeks later, I found out, I may have just read it in the newspaper, that this 14-year-old boy went home, maybe the next day, but very shortly thereafter, put his Boy Scout uniform on, went to the basement, and hung himself. He hung himself. And I felt directly responsible because I knew, I felt. You could argue 6 ways to Sunday, I had nothing to do with that, but I felt I was culpable, and the way that, the authorities can label someone's hands to be a lethal weapon, at that point, I felt that my mouth was a lethal weapon, and I just felt, this terrible, this family that had been so good to me, their prized cousin, the mother's sister's son, was dead, 14 years old. It's unheard of. I really felt responsible. And somehow that day, something flipped in my head, and I went, I'm against the Vietnam War. I'm with the Quakers. Do with me what thou wilt. I'm with you. He won the argument. You know what I mean? Maybe Bob Eaton didn't win the argument that day, but that boy went home and he won the argument. So now I'm against the Vietnam War, and I'm with the Quakers. And I can remember going on a march from my town to Princeton, New Jersey, about 16 miles one day, a peace march, about 20 of us, people going by and throwing eggs at us. It was not a popular opinion to be against the war. It kind of never is. But, I was all in. And next thing you know, I'm in high school, and I met a boy who was about a year older than I was, and we fell in love. And part of the story of our relationship was he didn't want to serve. He was 17, he was coming up on 18, and he was like many, it was kind of in the air that people didn't want to serve. It was people were just not going to go. And so that was a big part of our relationship. And on the winter of '67, he ran away, left home because he had to register for the draft or something, and he went to New York City and he burned his draft card at Sheep's Meadow Park or whatever it was with a bunch of maybe 100 other people. And it was a big deal to burn your draft card. That was illegal. It was an act of civil disobedience. Next thing you know, he's involved in a walk from New York City to Washington, D.C., about a little over 200 miles with the Quakers. There were about 30 people involved in this walk, and it was to protest the Vietnam War. And, as he's going down, they come to Delaware, and they're all arrested. And, he's taken into jail, and they shave his head. He writes me a letter, and they eventually let him out, like the next day or something. He wrote me a letter, and he said, in the newspaper, they said that someone had paid our fine, but no one did. He said, I'll never believe another newspaper. And so that was kind of the beginning of my having an idea that maybe everything that's printed isn't true. But they left Delaware, and they proceeded down to Washington, D.C., and they were headed to the Pentagon. And these 30 people, they were going to enter the Pentagon and lie down. And they weren't going to move in an act of civil disobedience. So they did that. They entered the Pentagon, and they went what is called super limp, and that's when you just don't help the person who's trying to remove you. So I'm at home, and I kind of knew I kind of knew what was going on. This is before cell phones and Facebook, and so you're kind of out of the loop when someone was out of touch, and he wasn't calling me all the time. So I just didn't know. But my mother and I were in the living room watching the nightly news, and on Walter Cronkite's news, there is my boyfriend, my one true love, being drugged out of the Pentagon, super limp. And there he is on national television. And I'm like, oh my God, it was profoundly, it affected me profoundly. It's like my little relationship is kind of the part of the energy that is creating this kind of national event, and it was a big deal to me. It was later, many people, Abby Hoffman tried to levitate the Pentagon, and there was a march on Washington with hundreds of thousands of people. But this was like the first one. It was just like us, like a little teeny group of people. Very unpopular opinion we had. This was not cool. But this is my life, and then after that, somehow he went to Haight-Ashbury. He was back and forth. It was the summer of love. I was in love. I was born in 1950, so I kind of hit my marks in terms of the baby boom, summer of love. And he went to Haight-Ashbury, and we kind of fell out of touch. What I didn't realize in retrospect, I thought it was very glamorous, going to Haight-Ashbury and all, and it was the media kind of made it to be a big thing. Flowers in your hair, all this. Drugs started to come into it, LSD and all this business. But what I realized in retrospect was basically he made himself homeless. He was basically just a homeless person. He was a musician, but not a successful one, didn't have any money. And he was living rough, and it was very difficult for him. So I didn't hear much from him. And he was running from the law at that point, because he was not complying with his draft board, because they had visited him and he was on the run. So I went off to college eventually. I went to Boston University. So I'm off to college. I went to the College of General Studies at Boston University, which is the alma mater of Howard Stern, the shock jock. And my fellow students, Howard Stern was totally typical of the students in that college. We were all disaffected, hippie youth. We were in college kind of because we had to be, kind of to please our parents. And my idea about becoming a lawyer had just like dropped off. It was like my relationship to the, system was very distant, and still was, trying to get through college. The idea of going to law school was somewhere there, but I was getting very vague about what my future was. But I was in college. And then I transferred to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and my choice of that had absolutely everything to do with the anti-war action at the college campus. I was there after the main action. I arrived a year after that, and I fell in with a group of people from New York City, basically. People from the East Coast, but I loved Madison. Madison was such a breath of fresh air. It was on 3 lakes. In the summer, they would have sailing, and there was a beach. There was a co-op, a food co-op, and it was the first co-ops, where you go in with your recycled plastic container and you dip it into the oats, and you'd volunteer, you put your time in, and it was health food. All these things were coming in: health food, organic agriculture. It was just a great place to be, and a big party school. There was one day of the week when you didn't party. I think that was Wednesday, but parties were between Thursday and Tuesday, and it just kind of lightened me up, and I had a good time there. I mean, made good friends. But after school, I decided to go back to Philadelphia, which is where my parents were from. It was kind of close to my home. I didn't really know where to go. All my friends from college were going to New York City. I knew that if I went to New York City, bad things would happen because I just didn't have the chops. I mean, they grew up in the city, but it just wasn't for me. I was really a country girl, and I just didn't, it would have been devastating. So Philadelphia is a very boring city, and it kind of suited me. It was like not much happening in Philly. It was not a cool city, and I was all about being cool, and it was time for me to cool off, just get down to business, learn how to support yourself, which I did. Took these rudimentary jobs. Eventually, I decided to become a waitress because it was a job you could do 3 days a week and make pretty good money. I mean, I think back, I could make $200 on a Saturday night, and even today, almost 40 something years later, it's still pretty good money. I wouldn't mind $200 in one day. And I got a job at a place called the Victor Cafe. And this had started out as a record store in the 20s. Philadelphia is across from Camden, New Jersey, the home of Victor Records. And was it Victor Records? Yeah, I think what was the name of that record company? Anyway, a big record company. And the guy who had this record store would take singers over to Camden to try to get them contracts. And people would come in and listen to records at the record store before they bought these 78 records. And when the Depression came, people weren't buying records anymore. So he turned it into a restaurant. But he had this large collection of classical and vocal music. So when people would eat their Italian meal, he'd play records. And he was a great lover of opera. He's an Italian. And opera singers, after they sang at the Academy of Music, would come down and have supper at the cafe, and they would sing. After they had their meal, they would sing. And the walls, when I got there, were lined with signed photographs of all the famous singers that had visited the Victor Cafe. Many of them had sung there. But when I got there in the 70s, the train wasn't stopping there anymore. The opera singers weren't coming down after the opera, and very few people sang. Eventually, the owner, Enrico De Stefano, John's son, allowed waiters to sing at the restaurant, and that was a big deal. Now the restaurant was kind of getting, a little more attractive to customers. When I first got to the cafe, I listened to this opera music, and I thought, this is the worst music I've ever heard. If they don't change the kind of music that they play here, they're going to go out of business. I thought, who can tolerate this? But opera is all about exposure, and you get an ear for it. And one of the things I'm so grateful for having worked there for 8 years, which I did, was that I got an ear for music. And I really got a total education in music appreciation. I hear an opera coming on the radio, and I can hum along, practically sing the words, and even classical orchestral pieces. I just got a tremendous musical education. And the waiters and waitresses I work with were opera singers. Great group of people. And I sort of got adopted. I had a habit of getting adopted by families, and they had 6 kids, once again, Italians. I kind of got adopted by Henry and Lola, and part of the family. But during this time, when I was at Wisconsin, I got initiated into transcendental meditation. It wasn't until I got to Philadelphia that I became regular in my meditation. Okay, so I was meditating regularly, and what I noticed from meditating, this transcendental meditation, was that my luck seemed to change, and I got happier, and the stress seemed to leave me. Things became easier. And, I didn't know exactly how it worked, but I really felt it did. And I had a proselytizing phase after I started to figure out this thing really worked. I was just running around trying to drag people to I'd pay for them to meditate. I'd just drag them, pay for anything. Mr. DeStefano, I gave him $100 to get initiated. He very kindly gave me my $100 back and said, thanks very much, but no thanks. And I remember at one point there were 3 people, waiters and waitresses at the restaurant, who were meditators, and we'd go back before the night shift, for the evening shift, and we'd meditate together. And that was like super radiance in the restaurant. And I think it had a good effect on the restaurant. And I think it was good for business. But because I only worked 3 days, the other 2 days I would go to the TM Center in Philadelphia and I would check meditations. I learned how to become a TM checker. I never became a teacher. I always had a lot of dental work, so I could never afford to become a teacher. I never tried to do that. But I felt so grateful for meditating. And I liked hanging around meditators and being around the TM Center. So I probably checked 800 meditations, over the time that I was volunteering there, probably 6 or 7 years. And so I started to get more involved with the TM movement and going on residence courses and hanging out with other meditators who kind of had a brighter, cleaner way of life, and it was a very good influence on me. So the Victor Cafe, this place I worked, was immortalized in a movie decades after I left there called Rocky Balboa. Sylvester Stallone from Philadelphia, Philadelphia's favorite son, star of the Rocky, creator of Rocky, rented the Victor Cafe and filmed the movie Rocky Balboa at the Victor Cafe. And when I watched that movie, I was brought to tears when I saw the landing where I would stand and listen to the singers with the door behind it to the stairs down to the kitchen, where I would go up and down the stairs for years, bringing trays of food, to serve the clients. And so it to me, it was like a wonderful thing that the Victor Cafe had, instead of going out of business like I predicted, it just kept growing and getting a bigger footprint in the world. So I was really happy when I saw that movie. But eventually, as a waitress, I was getting to be my early 30s. I knew I had to do something else. Now, I had wanted to be a lawyer. That dream went, and I became a waitress. Just and if you could have predicted the most likely person to become a waitress, I guarantee it was not me. It just kind of happened. I was happy as a waitress. It's okay. But I had to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So there was a fellow named Charlie Lutz who had gone around the world with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi 4 times. He would do public speaking, lectures in the Philadelphia area. And he was a very inspirational speaker, great sense of humor. I truly I totally respected his opinion. People would go up to him and ask Charlie what they should do with their lives, and I never did that. I thought that was kind of copping out. But one day I was just so desperate. I was like, boy, I need help with this. What do I do, Got to get out of this waitressing. So I went up to him and I said, Charlie, you always say that we should do what we enjoy, do what we like. And my mother was an artist. I always kind of liked art. I said, but Charlie, I'm good at art, but I don't think I can make a living at it. And he said to me, what about commercial art? I said, yeah, fine, just add a dollar sign in front of the art. Yeah, commercial art. Okay, I can do that. So I started taking courses in New York and locally in commercial art. And at the time I began, I was just kind of lucky. Commercial art was being computerized. And I can remember going up to New York and being on this computer with a computer graphics program. Before the Mac, it was called Silicon Graphics. And you had 256,000 colors at your fingertips. Free, My mother had to buy paints. They were messy. And here I had all this, freedom of expression at my fingertips. And I was sold. I fell in love with that. So I just kept taking courses. I stopped waitressing. I took small jobs at one advertising agency, then a larger advertising agency. Eventually, I ended up at a newspaper with a union job doing typesetting. I had garnered my skills, kind of cobbled them together, and I would go into work at night. I worked second shift, and it was like going in and being paid to play video games. And I would also listen to my books on tape, and It was great. I mean, I really enjoyed that job, and I did it for 10 years. While I was working at the newspaper, I had a little free time. I was only working 4 days a week, and I was set up at home with my Mac system. In those days, you could get a little Mac and set yourself up. And I heard about something called the Natural Law Party. And this is something that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi had tasked Purusha, which was a group of celibate men who would do projects that Maharishi had laid out for them. Well, and they were never small projects. It was like redo the financial system of the world, things like that. Well, this was create a worldwide political party. And I loved working with these Purusha guys, and they would call me and give me tasks to do. And kind of by default, I became the chairperson of the Natural Law Party in Pennsylvania, and I held that position for 6 years. I just had a lot of fun with it, calling other meditators, organizing events, working with other people who were involved with the party, fielding candidates. We would take anybody who would subject themselves to it, and you could run for anything. Qualifications didn't really matter. And it was a national program. People were doing this all over the United States. And eventually, it was in 1998, kind of by default, I ran for Congress in the 8th District of Pennsylvania. And I had to get 4,000 signatures. My mother helped me get signatures. That was one of the big things of getting on the ballot, is you had to get a certain amount of signatures. And I would go out and meet the public, talk to people, and I kind of got over a little bit of my shyness from doing this, because after a couple thousand people, just walking up to total strangers and asking them for a signature and having to give them a little riff about what is the Natural Law Party, what do you believe in, blah, blah, blah. I got kind of over that little shyness that I might have had. And I was interviewed on a cable news television show, a pretty popular show, and terrified. And I would read these pamphlets from the Natural Law Party, but I kind of memorized what we believed in, but I knew nothing, and I was just kind of cobbling this thing together in my head that I could answer these questions. Like when she asked me, so why are you running for Congress? Shouldn't you kind of start a little smaller? Which was a really good question, like dog catcher. But, I said, well, we have big ideas. It needs a big platform, And so I got through that, and then I was in the debates with the congressional candidates and locally. And in those debates, I got to be really good friends, chums, with the incumbent, a guy named Jim Greenwood, Republican, great guy. And somehow the two of us bonded on stage, and because I didn't really want to win, and in the Natural Law Party, we weren't against, that was what we said, we weren't against anything. We were for particular ideas, and really we were just trying to introduce these ideas into the atmosphere so that we could get a platform, they would get a platform to be heard and introduced. So I wasn't adversarial in any way. And he would throw me a line, and I'd throw him a line, and we just had a lot of fun with it. And, I got through that. And coming up to election at the newspaper, there was a wager, and I never knew who it was between. It was between one guy and somebody else. I knew the one guy, but the other guy chose to remain anonymous. And for an undisclosed amount of money, if I would get 0 votes, one was voting 0, and I had speculated I would get 1% of the vote, which is what Natural Law Party candidates were getting throughout the United States. And one guy was just like, no way. So he lost the wager because I got over 1,000 votes. And I was just pleased. It's probably people from my neighborhood that I'd grown up with, people I met walking around, maybe some people who saw me on the debates, or just, it wasn't, people I think are always looking for some type of an alternative, or for decades in the country. So you're going to get 1% of the people who are going to give you a vote. So that was a good experience. Now, at the newspaper, because it was a union job, they were trying to shed workforce, because they're always trying to automate, and they offered everyone a buyout. And because I've been there for 10 years, I was eligible for a buyout. And that was great. So I was kind of done with that. And I figured I could go off on my own. Some of the people were like lifers, a lot of the people there were lifers. I was not a lifer. So I was one of the people who took the buyout. And August 31st, it was not only it was a lump sum of money, it was also unemployment. You were eligible for unemployment for a year. So August 31st, 2001, I left my job, and my goal was to go home to my little Mac office and learn how to create websites, which was a good plan because in 2001 it was a burgeoning skill, a valuable skill. So I was home and I was kind of getting myself organized, and I'm going to learn how to build these websites. And 2001, September, 9/11 happens. Bada bing, bada boom. Maharishi calling all cars, meditators, Fairfield, Iowa, create world peace. And I heard the call because I didn't have a job. I had money, and I could go. I didn't have any excuses. I had known about Fairfield, but I never wanted to go to Fairfield and not be able to support myself. Because the thing I had always heard about Fairfield was it was a real hard place to support yourself. I didn't want to move, take all the expense and trouble of moving there, and end up bouncing back. But in this case, I had nothing to lose. I went with a friend from Bucks County. We were one of the first people flying out, once planes were allowed to travel again. And it was kind of a spooky experience, flying out after the attacks. And we ended up in Fairfield, and I ended up meditating in the domes. I think it was probably long meditations for world peace, which was great. The questions of peace, war and peace, were like real big from my early life. And I tried the protesting thing and found it wanting. And Maharishi had given the tools of how to create world peace silently, without conflict, without action, physical action. If you would simply gather with others with similar intention to lower the temperature of the world consciousness and calm it. I believed. I thought, it's worth a try. And in fact, when I was working at one of the advertising agencies, I told my boss that somehow it came up that this was a possibility. He says, well, if this is possible, you should be out there. It made sense. It made sense to even, somebody who knew very little about it. So here I was in Iowa meditating. I was happy to be here. And 3 months later, I met my husband, Gary. So about 3 months after moving to Fairfield, Iowa, I turned the corner one day, eyes across the crowded room, love at first sight. I met my one and only Gary, my future husband. And now I was an Iowan. I was all in. I had been a Pennsylvanian. Now I'm an Iowan. So I was committed to living here. I ended up getting a job at Maharishi International University in the press. I did pre-press at the Maharishi had a dedicated press for his publications. And I learned some skills there, how to do pre-press for printing, and a lot about the printing business. I worked there for a while, but then I decided I'd kind of had it with that, and I wanted to go off on my own and do freelance work. I had, a computer at home, I could do that. And so I left the university and I joined the Invincible American course, as well as doing my freelance work. And that was going into the Golden Domes and doing long meditations every day. And you got paid a little stipend for it, which was nice. It was the best job I ever had. I got paid to meditate. It's wonderful. I loved it. And I did that for about 7 years, and I was doing my freelance work. But one of the things that happened when I went home to work on my computer, now this is kind of the burgeoning of the information age. And I'd hear about the information age, but I didn't really understand the ramifications of it. This is a time when you have so much information at your fingertips in your home. And I just was I took real advantage of this. A very curious person. I wanted to know, what can I find out here? And one of the questions I had always had, I was 13 years old when John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated, and I was a great fan of his. I was such a fan of his, as were so many people. He was an extremely popular president. And when he was gunned down in Dallas, after a period of time, not immediately, but after a period of time, through the work of Mark Lane and Jim Garrison, I realized that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald who killed Kennedy. And I, like so many Americans, wanted to know who actually killed the man. Who killed the man, It wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Who was it? Who was behind that? And there was a show called Black Op Radio with Leno Sanik, and it was a podcast. That was a whole new thing, podcast. He had researchers who had done in-depth research into different aspects of the Kennedy assassination, both assassinations, also Robert and Martin Luther King's assassination. And I would listen, hundreds and hundreds of hours of these in-depth researchers talking about really getting into the weeds of who's on first and who was where, and, a simple coincidence like the fact that Oswald was being shepherded around Dallas by a guy named George de Mohrenschildt, who was a white Russian. He had left Russia. White Russian means like aristocrat, who had dated Jackie Kennedy's mother, Janet Auchincloss. Jackie Kennedy knew him. He's chaperoning Lee Harvey Oswald around Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald was a defector to the Soviet Union. So a white Russian is going to shepherd a defector from America to the Soviet Union who came back with no ramifications. Nothing was done to this man. In fact, he was given a little money, with a Russian wife whose father, if you look into it, was probably a KGB officer. I mean, something doesn't add up here. These people should not be hanging out together. Think facts like that, and then they do more research and more research. And, it was very interesting to me, but one of the things that it did was I started to realize that much of our modern history just doesn't hold water. The facts don't support it. Another thing that happened to me when I was working at the university, I was working so hard. I was in the dining hall getting my food to take back to my office. A friend of mine, Phil Bedell, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, he said to me, "Carolyn," he said, 9/11's an inside job. And I said, "Phil, I think they're capable of anything, but if they did it, I don't want to know about it." And that was when I was at the university. But, once I got home, I was willing to take a look behind the curtain and see, well, what did happen that day, and some of the anomalies. And there were a lot of anomalies, and there was so much research into it. How did the buildings come down? I mean, we were kind of hypnotized by this constant replay of these buildings like disappearing like sand, free fall speed. But intellectually, I didn't really think about it. Like, that doesn't look right. It's a nice magic trick. It's kind of like pulling a, tablecloth out and, leaving the dishes on the table. But it, upon reflection and getting into the physics of it, there was something more to it. So I became what is, in common parlance known as a conspiracy theorist, and what I really considered to be is just a curious person looking for the truth. But, over time, I just kind of, decided that it was above my pay grade, let's put it that way. It was intellectually fascinating, and it was, very interesting. I felt very gratified that, this, I kind of do know who killed Kennedy now. I don't know who, but I have a better idea of it, and so in that way, it was very worthwhile. But for me, the important thing, and the reason that I'm here in Fairfield, Iowa, and the reason I was so happy to be here is because Maharishi gave us a technology that I actually believe in to actually uh, solve the problems of the world and prevent the type of situations, adverse situations that I was looking into. And so I'm doing what I can. By living here, I think it was actually kind of my destiny to move here, but to just do what I can in the service of making this a better country, and and actually a better world. Thanks for listening.